Welcome to episode 2 of the Spring Update series, where today we're joined by Jon Gibb, Director of the Lochaber District Salmon Fishery Board. And he's also the Fishery Manager on the River Lochy, one of the west coast of Scotland's classic salmon rivers and much sought after fly fishing destination. Jon is a passionate angler and country sportsman, but he's also equally passionate about the well-being and sustainability of the West Highland communities in which he lives and works. For this episode, we'll be discussing the West Coast Tracking Project and have Byron Pace with us again to ask Jon a series of questions. Good to see you both.
Great to see you, Mark. Jon?
Morning, Mark. Good to see you.
So I guess I can probably just fire straight in. Jon, last time the discussion that we had was about the East Coast, of the tracking project on the East Coast, but you're involved in the West Coast Tracking Project. Tell me what that's all about and why being involved in that really appeals to you.
Yeah, morning, Byron. Yeah, good. Well, obviously, you know, as we know, East Coast, West Coast, very different topography, very different salmon rivers, apart from anything else. But importantly for this, very, very different coastal zones. I'm reminded of that often, actually, when I stand on estuaries like the Neva or the Helmsdale or even the Findhorn, and I sort of look out to the North Sea, and you imagine you're a smolt going to sea, and you've got a pretty direct route into that ocean, you know. And then you stand on parts of the West Coast, and you know it's a very, very complex layout. You've got fjords, sea locks, islands, channels, tides, all sorts of things before the fish hit the sea, you know, the proper open ocean. I mean, there's parts of the West Coast where, you know, a smolt could be traveling nearly 100 miles before it gets to actual open ocean, as opposed to, you know, a few hundred yards in some cases on the East Coast. So it's an entirely different thing. So yeah, obviously to track smolts, you know, going out is a huge challenge on the West Coast, but hugely interesting for all sorts of reasons, if it's possible.
And so what kind of breadth does the West Coast project encapsulate? How many rivers, how many miles? Give people an idea, because for those people who maybe can't picture the West Coast, you've already described it's very different, but there's a lot more coastline on the West Coast just because of the nature of the terrain.
Yeah, well, our involvement is actually in this sort of Lochaber scale. So Mark can probably tell you how many rivers are involved and exactly what the scope is at the moment. But certainly for us, we're looking at one river this year in our region and 2 tributaries of that river. So we'll be tagging smolts out of 2 tributaries of one river. But I know the project's much bigger than that, but Mark will be able to tell you about that.
So the plan, it really is throughout the whole of the west coast of Scotland. The most southerly river is the Nith, just in the Solway Firth, and we extend up the west coast, calling in places such as the Clyde, the Lomond, through Argyll, Lochaber, out to Skye, into West Ross, heading up into West Sutherland, as far north as Laxford. And then going out to the west, we're also looking at rivers on the Outer Hebrides on Lewis. There's a couple of rivers on Lewis that we're looking at. So it really is trying to track fish right throughout the west coast and get a good understanding of how they're navigating these waters.
Interesting. So this is an incredibly, as indeed the East Coast project was in any case, but this is the ambition level here has been raised once again. Jon, can you tell me a little bit about what you're hoping to gain from this? What is the most valuable part of this research? What are you hoping to gain from it?
Sure. Well, I mean, certainly we've been talking for best part of 25 years on the West Coast about that we don't actually know how the smolts exit to go to sea. And the relevance of that has increased exponentially over the years, actually, particularly because of marine developments. And that may be fish farms, it may be wind farms, it may be tidal arrays, anything in the future as well. There's bound to be more pressure on the ocean environment. And we, particularly as a fishery board, when we respond to consultations about these things, the one big gap in our knowledge is actually, where do our smolts go? Because there's so many different routes they could go, is we don't actually know. So this is a hugely important development actually if we can monitor and measure this. I mean, I'll give you one example with the aquaculture developments. When aquaculture first started, there was a lot of ignorance in every side, and fish farms were put perhaps where we wouldn't put them now, and the industry developed like that. We're now, over the last few years, and particularly the Lochaber region is a good example of this, we're starting to see more deep water locations being developed. Not quite offshore yet, but deep water, so around Rum and Colonsay and these sort of inner islands. Now, we're doing that because we think that this will be safer for the outgoing smolt, because you're not in an enclosed sea loch. Where you have an enclosed sea loch, particularly ones that face the prevailing wind, you have a problem with sea lice. Now, we're assuming to a degree that these outer locations will have less of a problem with sea lice. Now, wouldn't it be good if we actually knew that some of the migration paths didn't go near some of these farms? Or conversely, it would be most important to know that some of the migration paths did go near some of these proposed farms. So we start to make much more informed planning decisions as a community. And that's just one example, but I mean, it's very, very important because we have been slightly operating with a degree of ignorance about this over the years.
This might be a question more for you, Mark, but last time we talked a lot about the knowledge being gained in river. How far are you going to be able to track smolts once they actually enter the sea? I was going to say this year. We'll get to why that's not happening this year just shortly. But in the West Coast project, how far out to sea are you going to be able to track smolt?
Okay, if you can imagine the west coast of Scotland up from the border with England, we're working with other partners, and there's other projects going on. So there's going to be listening stations being deployed between the island of Ireland and Islay, right across the Irish Sea. So we'll be able to track those fish from Solway up through the Irish Sea, north into Scotland, and we can work out whether they go into the Minch, the area C between the mainland Scotland and the Outer Hebrides, or whether they go out to the continental shelf. The arrays that we're putting in, these listening stations that we're putting in, the main ones that we're putting in are between Skye and the Outer Hebrides. So we're sort of enclosing that area C, plus doing quite a large number of receivers around points of interest, such as around the coastline, just off the coast from Jon. He's explained how sort of diverse and complex that environment is. So we've been putting these receivers there to see how the fish use it. And the picture we're trying to build with our partners in Marine Scotland is to test one of their models. They've got a computer model that looks at how smolts theoretically disperse from their rivers. So what we're doing is collecting information that will help test those models to see if they are describing the real world and can work out where smolts from rivers across Scotland are going. In terms of the furthest north, this year we had hoped to get just north of Stornoway out to the west on the Peninsula Point and up to Cape Wrath in West Sutherland.
Jon, beyond understanding the actual migration path, what might you learn when smolts go missing? Because you're going to tag lots of smolts, but you're not actually going to be able to track all of them because we know that there is loss.
Yeah. Well, I think firstly it's very important to say on this West Coast project that what is being measured here is migration paths. So it's not a project designed to look at predation loss, for example. That would be another problem. That would be another experiment. There is an exception to that, but it's a very localized exception. It just so happens that on the River Lochy, the River Lochy Association have contributed a bit to the project, and we are actually putting some receivers down the river. Now that will be potentially to look at loss, but that's a very localized, almost sort of subsection of the project. So the bigger project is not to look at that. Obviously it's of great interest to me from a management perspective if, you know, all of my smolts aren't making it to the outer arrays. You know, this is something that's going to be very interesting to find out, and then perhaps even compare that to the East Coast smolts, perhaps, you know, if it was appropriate. But you know, certainly loss is it's going to be interesting, but I think it's important to realize this is not measuring loss, because you would do something else then.
So the ambition was this was all going to roll out this year, but as all of us are probably sitting in the homes that we are confined to right now, I imagine that you faced a lot of difficulties with getting this up and running in 2020. What challenges have you faced, and what is the plan now?
Okay, perhaps I can answer this one. First of all, we've been hugely helped by partners in this project, at Glasgow University and Marine Scotland. These people, along with some amazing staff at the Atlantic Salmon Trust and people on the fishery boards and trusts, have come together to get all of the kit. I mean, it is tons of equipment into the right place at the right time. I think we were probably within 24 hours of deploying all of the marine arrays. We had the boats ready to go. We had everyone trained up. We had all the equipment in the right place. And then we got the announcement by the Prime Minister of the lockdown, which meant that we couldn't safely deploy this, which in hindsight means it was good that we've saved the equipment, because there's always a risk when this kit's out in the sea that it can get dredged up or it can get damaged, because the weather out on the west is a little wild occasionally. With having it safe, we're good to go for next year. So what we're doing is we're pausing the project for a year, because it's better to stay safe and come back hale and hearty for next year, which is our full intention. But it also gives us the opportunity to make sure that we can wring the most out of this study. You know, are we getting as much information as we can from where we've got the receivers? We're using everything in the best way, and so we can review that over the next few weeks and months with a view to starting to get ready for deployment for next year. That process starts in July, to get ready for the spring run of smolts next March, April, May.
John, just as a way of maybe bringing this discussion to a close, are there any other projects that you're working on right now? Obviously, you might not actually be able to physically be working on right now, not being able to get out, but that the board are involved in your area.
Certainly, yeah. There's always projects. I mean, as a fishery board, obviously, like every fishery board, we're involved in the business of measuring and mitigating against all the impacts on salmon, of which there are many, many. And that's before they even get to sea. It might be hydro, it might be forestry, it might be the well-known West Coast pastime of salmon poaching, which I'm glad to say is not quite as bad as it used to be. But you know, we're busy over here. But we do have, you and I have talked a little bit about some of our projects in the past. We've got some new things going on. We have issues with escapes from salmon farms and potential issues with diseases in wild salmon. So we look at live gene banking, genetic material in cryopreservation tanks in Norway. We've got milt over there at the moment for various rivers. It's quite an unusual experiment, that one. So we do salmon carcass placement in spawning burns. People have heard of this in other areas with deer carcasses and stuff like that. We use actual salmon carcasses of kelts, and we distribute these into spawning burns, try and improve the habitat and the bugs and beasties for the young salmon, improve the nutrient. We're doing a very experimental project at the moment, just on one tributary or one river, a very, very depleted stock, where we're actually rearing some fish in the sea to try and bypass the marine phase of salmon. And we're actually going to, instead of running there's a lot of talk about hatcheries. We indeed do have a hatchery, but actually we're trying to bypass the hatchery, and we're actually rearing adult salmon in the sea, indigenous salmon that have been trapped as smolt. And we're going to release these adult salmon visually tagged, and into a spawning burn and let them get on with it. Let them get on with the spawning. It's been done in Canada on one river, and we're doing it here in Scotland. So we're going to monitor that very carefully. It's quite quite a new thing, that. But yeah, always a lot going on.
Brilliant. After spending many years on the West Coast, I know how busy an area it is, and I know the power of work that the Bourton Trust do over there. So, gentlemen, a huge thanks to yourself, Jon, Byron, for your time today. We look forward to sharing more information in our next episode, episode 3. I want to thank everyone for their support and positive feedback that we've had so far. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Stay safe.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jon. Thanks, Byron.